As we've been well publicised by now, the iconic Holden badge will be gone by year's end, and with it, not just a massive chunk of our own history, but another 600 precious auto jobs. Well, sensing the shock among the public, the Prime Minister led a chorus of indignation.
Of course I'm disappointed, not surprised, but I think the fact that they took money from Australian taxpayers for all those years just to let the Holden brand wither on their watch, I think is disappointing.
Yes, but if the PM were fair dinkum, instead of having a crack at GM, he would be wise to look, I think, a little closer to home. I mean, make no mistake here, General Motors and the unions are not without blame. But over the last decade, the Australian government and we, the Australian public, hardly encouraged Holden to hang on. When put simply, we, the public, stopped buying them. In the heyday, Holden accounted for 50% of all new car sales. Today, it's close to 4%. And then consider recent government policy. Canberra's withdrawn financial support, signed disadvantageous free trade agreements, overseen massive hikes in energy prices and abolished the tariffs. And while all these policies have been good for areas like agriculture and international education, they've destroyed most of our manufacturing sector, especially car makers. I mean, bear this in mind, there's not a single example anywhere in the world of a viable auto industry where the local government has pulled its support. And sadly for the free trade purists, their ideology just doesn't apply to cars. Now look, the loss of the Holden line shouldn't just make us nostalgic for Bathurst, Commodores and Monaros. It should also make us ponder the broader deindustrialisation of this country and whether we've gone too hard too fast down the free trade ideological highway. Well, let's see what the panel makes of all of that. Karina, how about you go first?
Michael, as you said, subsidising a private company has never proved to be the way to go. Certainly it was, simply delaying the inevitable. But if I can pull you up on something, it was the Labor government, Gillard at the time, who introduced co-investment. I think she fooled no one by using that term co-investment. Everyone knew that this was subsidies. But as you pointed out, they don't work. The reality is, though, that our manufacturing industry in Australia is all but dead, sadly. Rising energy costs, cost of labour make it very difficult for companies to operate in Australia. But the most, I think, disappointing thing is to lose that know-how, that capability to manufacture cars in this country when that is critical, particularly in times when there might be trade bans, there might be crisis around the world, which would mean that there's a risk to Australia not being able to have that capacity to manufacture.
See, the point I was making in essence is that although tariffs and protections aren't ideal, certainly I believe in free trade and I believe in capitalism. But in certain industries, and I think we've got to differentiate the economy here between just industries, and I come from a family that runs a small business, so call it an industry, as opposed to strategic industries. Yep. And when you lose the auto industry, you lose, as you say, not just the ability to make cars, you lose the factories, you lose the skill, the know-how, and the ancillary jobs generally that go with it. And there isn't an example anywhere around the world, be it in a socialist economy or indeed a capitalist one like Germany or America, where when government completely withdraws, as ours have done, and I'm not saying Liberal or Labor, both, that the car industry survives. It doesn't exist. I mean, if you want this industry and if you want the skills and the jobs and the potential conversion that we could have in a war, I mean, you're not going to convert bed and breakfasts for the war effort, you've got to convert a factory, then you've got to subsidise this industry. And I know from the Liberal Party point of view, it's hard to swallow, but we've lost it.
And I think it's important to point out that they have subsidised both the Coalition and the Labor government to the tune of about $2.7 billion over the course of 11 years. What was really interesting to me was not only the PM's disappointment, but the fact that he seemed quite out of touch with the manufacturing sector because he didn't know that Holden was making this announcement. So he didn't have his finger on the pulse. But it's not just governments propping up. I think what happened with Holden is they lost, as your figures rightly pointed out, they lost their popularity with the Australian people. They had very popular sedans, but then when SUVs started to become quite popular, they didn't innovate quickly enough. So I think it's it's a bit of a shared blame game here. And also, I think that perhaps the Holden-Ford rivalry, which was kind of cute in the 80s and 90s, actually perhaps worked to polarise people and even shrink a shrinking consumer base.
I think that things started to really turn south in the early 2000s when they stopped selling quality imported cars, such as the Viva and the Epica. I mean, Holden was once such a trusted brand, and then the quality just went down south. There were complaints about squeaky dashboards and mechanical issues, and so it became never-ending. And then in 2013, when they announced that manufacturing would, leave Australia, that's really when that began to spell the beginning of the end, in my opinion.
So Michael, what do you think should have happened instead? More subsidies, reintroduce tariffs? Like, what do you...
Well, if you want to keep the industry, you have to subsidise it. As I said, I don't like subsidies by nature.
But
if my family's small business didn't cater for the market that it operates in, it would go broke, and we wouldn't expect the government to subsidise it. But in essence, and no disrespect to it, it's not a strategic industry. This is. And I'm very glad I've lived in a time where we've never known war, and we've never had to, in essence, fight a global conflict and convert the economy to the effort. But if that comes, and history shows it will, we are completely vulnerable because we've lost almost all our heavy industry. And if you want to
but arguably
be prepared...
we'll be fighting a very different war.
Well, arguably, but we don't know. That's a theory. I mean, you've got to be prepared. And if you lose your industries, they're very unlikely to come back. And the only way these industries survive is through subsidies, not just here, in America, in Asia, in Germany, everywhere. They either get cheap land to build their factories, or they get direct financial subsidies for the workers, or they have special tax arrangements. Without them, they don't exist in those economies. And we thought, oh, well, we could do it. Well, we've got the result.
But I'd be keen to know if the government is going to scrap the luxury car tax now.
Yeah, well, they won't.
Well, they should.
Well,
they should.
Because
it didn't work.
And it targets the wrong people. You've got farmers, drought-stricken farmers who need, Land Cruisers and large vehicles like that, and they don't have the extra money to fork out. So they're the ones who are being targeted, and I think it needs to go.
Should go.
Michael, if I can pick up on the point that you make that this is an industry that has to be subsidised. Private industry shouldn't be subsidised. The market should, allow, hopefully, it to thrive if it is a viable industry.
But that's ideology, not practicality.
No, not ideology.
No,
but there is certainly things that government can do beyond the go-to, let's subsidise, which, just delays the inevitable, which, we've seen the collapse as a result of it. But, for example, adjusting procurement policies of government to make sure that only Australian vehicles, Australian manufactured vehicles are purchased by government are simple ways that can help to support an industry, support the market.
Sure, that's very sensible.
Subsidies is not the go-to, let's just subsidise. This is taxpayers' money
but that's,
to support private enterprise.
If it was a very Liberal Party point of view.
Well, no, if it was government manufacturing vehicles, that's a whole different story. This is a private company.
Okay.
Why GM? Why GM over other companies?
But
why
it doesn't
should
matter.
They benefit?
It could be Great Wall for all I care building out here, but where in the world then do cars get manufactured where the government doesn't protect the industry?
And it's hard to compete
the answer
in that
is
market.
nowhere.
It's impossible to compete in that market.
In Australia, despite the subsidies, Holden still couldn't survive. Why? Because we have high energy costs. Why? Because we have high labour costs. It's just not possible in this policy setting, in this climate,
and also our proximity to Asia with their high-quality cars.
With the standards that we have in Australia for the manufacturing industry to survive. And that's something certainly that needs to be addressed. But trying to address it through subsidies doesn't work, and what we've seen is it hasn't worked, hence Holden is closed.